Snow was falling. Not the gentle kind, but thick, angry sheets of it, like the sky itself was being torn apart and thrown down at the world. The train station was a small, stubborn box fighting against the wind. It groaned and rattled, a tired old man in a blizzard. Etta Calhoun stood inside, trying to steal warmth from a pot-bellied stove that offered none. Her gloves were useless, thin as paper. Her hands were numb, but the cold in her chest was worse. She'd been waiting since morning. Every whistle, every screech of brakes had been a new knot of hope in her stomach. And every departing train was that knot being pulled tighter, cutting off her breath. The man she'd crossed half a country to marry never showed. The letter in her pocket felt like a hot coal, a promise of a home, a husband, a life. Now it was just a piece of paper mocking her. The station master, a man with eyes as gray as the storm, had pushed her trunk against the wall, a gesture of pity that felt like a slap. At 25, she was caught in that terrible place between what could have been and what felt like it was already too late. Men looked at her sideways. Women whispered behind their hands. She was a spectacle, a jilted bride, unwanted. The door flew open with a bang, letting in a swirl of snow and wind. Two little girls stood there, looking like they were carved from the winter itself. They couldn't have been more than 10, but their eyes were old. One of them, the one with a sharp chin and a sharp gaze, pointed a mittened finger right at Ida. "You're the bride, aren't you?" Ida's mouth went dry. The words wouldn't come. The other girl, quieter, with eyes like frozen water, nodded. "Pa didn't send for her," she whispered, her voice barely a sound. "But we did." The first girl, Lula, took a step forward. Her posture was that of a general. "We need a wife for our father," she declared, her voice ringing through the silent station. "And you need shelter." The stove popped, a sudden crack that jolted Ida from her shock. The girl's words weren't a question. They were a statement of fact, a business proposal delivered by a 10-year-old. Ida stared at their faces, searching for a prank, for some childish game. But there was none. There was only a deep, desperate need that mirrored the one screaming inside her own heart. "Your father. He doesn't know you're here," Etta managed, her voice a dry rasp. Lula's chin lifted higher. "He don't need to. He needs you." The station master groaned. "Girls, this ain't your business." But they didn't move. They stood there, two small pillars of defiance in the swirling cold. Ada felt it then, a strange pull. She was shamed, abandoned, a ghost in this station, and these children were offering her a purpose, a place. The quiet one, Sadi, spoke again, her voice as soft as the snow. "Ma's been gone too long. Pa won't say it, but he's lost. We can't keep things mended on our own." Loss recognizes loss. The words hit Ida like a physical blow. She thought of the empty life she'd left behind, the empty life that was waiting for her if she didn't do something. The train whistle cried out in the distance, a long, mournful sound. There was no train left for her, no home to go back to. Her choices had narrowed down to this single, impossible moment. Step into this insane offer from two children, or freeze to death on the platform, a monument to her own foolish hope. "Where do you live?" she whispered. A fierce, quick smile broke across Lula's face. "Out past Miller's Creek, Pa's ranch." The station master shook his head, muttering under his breath, "Lord, help us all. Hank Kincaid won't know what to do with this." But Etta barely heard him. The ground beneath her feet, which had felt like it was crumbling away, suddenly felt solid again. The girls reached for her hands, their small fingers surprisingly warm. They tugged her toward the door, out into the white chaos of the storm. And as she stepped out of the station, she realized she was walking toward a man who had no idea she was coming. A man who hadn't asked for her, led by two children playing God with the scraps of broken lives. This wasn't a rescue. This was a reckoning. The wagon ride was a journey into nothingness. The world was just white snow and black, skeletal fence posts. Eda's hands were frozen to the wooden side of the wagon, her knuckles white. The twins, Lula and Sadi, were huddled under a quilt, their silence more unsettling than the howling wind. This wasn't the excited chatter of children who'd gotten their way. It was the grim quiet of soldiers on a desperate mission. Finally, a shape emerged from the swirling snow. A house. It looked less like a home and more like a scar on the land, weathered and gray, its porch sagging like a broken jaw. Smoke curled from the chimney, but it wasn't a welcome. It was just a sign that someone inside was fighting the same losing battle against the cold. The wagon stopped. The horse snorted, its breath a thick plume of steam, and Ida's heart began to hammer against her ribs. This place wasn't a sanctuary. It was a trial. The door of the house opened and a man filled the frame. He was big, broad-shouldered, but he seemed stooped, as if carrying a weight no one could see. His face was a map of hardship, his beard frosted with ice. His eyes, the color of a winter sky just before it breaks, swept over his daughters and then landed on Ada. The air went tight. It was a string pulled taut, ready to snap. Lula, ever the brave one, jumped down from the wagon. "She's the bride," she announced to the silent man. "The one from the station. Her groom didn't come, so we fetched her." The man's jaw tightened. Not a flicker of surprise, not a hint of confusion, just a slow, hardening anger. He didn't say a word. He just turned his back and stalked back into the house, leaving the door hanging open. An invitation that felt like a dismissal. Ida stepped down, the icy slush biting at her ankles. Sadi's small hand found hers, guiding her onto the porch. The floorboards groaned under her weight, and for a terrifying second she thought they would splinter, dropping her into the frozen earth below. The inside of the house smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something else, something metallic and sad. It was dark, the only light coming from a dying fire in a massive stone hearth. Hank Kincaid stood by the fire, arms crossed, watching her. His silence was an accusation. It demanded to know what right she had to be here, to breathe his air. Lula, oblivious or just defiant, pulled Ida toward the fire. "She was freezing at the station, Pa. She needs to get warm." Hank's voice, when it finally came, cut through the room like a shard of ice. "She needs to leave." The words were clean, brutal, not cruel, just absolute. Ida felt her blood run cold. She wanted to speak, to explain, but her tongue was frozen to the roof of her mouth. She was a trespasser, an unwelcome ghost. But then Sadie, the quiet one, spoke up. Her voice trembled, but it was firm. "She's got nowhere else to go, Pa." Hank Kincaid looked at Ida then, his eyes scanning her from head to toe, as if she were a stray animal his children had dragged home. He let out a long, slow sigh, a sound that seemed to come from the deepest part of him. He gestured to a hard-backed chair by the wall. "Sit, if you must." She sat, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped in her lap. She was an object, a piece of unwanted furniture. The girls busied themselves with the fire, their nervous energy filling the oppressive silence. Hank disappeared into another room. She could hear his heavy boots on the floorboards, the sound of a door closing with finality. When he returned, he was carrying a rough, homespun blanket. He tossed it at her without looking. It landed in her lap. The wool was coarse, scratching her skin, but the small, reluctant gesture was the first hint of warmth she'd felt all day. Dinner was a silent, miserable affair, thin stew and dry bread. Hank ate without looking up. The twins whispered between themselves. Ida forced the food down, each swallow a reminder that she was eating a stranger's food, sitting in a dead woman's house. After the meal, Hank rose. He finally looked Ida in the eye. His gaze was weary, exhausted. "This house don't need strangers," he said. Something inside her snapped. "Neither do I," she heard herself say. The words hung in the air between them. A muscle twitched in his jaw, but he didn't reply. He just retreated to a rocking chair in the corner, becoming a part of the shadows. The wind howled. The house groaned. Ida lay on a small cot the girls had set up for her, listening to the sounds of the night, the creak of the rocker, the heavy pacing footsteps of a man trapped in his own home. She was sure the morning would bring her dismissal, the wagon ride back to the station, back to being a nobody, a cautionary tale whispered in the town square. But just as she was drifting into a restless sleep, she felt a small hand slip into hers. It was Sadie, her fingers curling around Ida's, and across the room, the rocking stopped. The pacing stopped. Through the darkness, she felt his eyes on her. Hank Kincaid was watching her, weighing her, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that her trial had only just begun. The question was no longer if he would let her stay. It was what he would do to her if she did. The thaw came, but it brought no relief. The snow melted, turning the prairie into a sea of mud, but the chill inside the Kincaid house remained. Ida worked from sunrise to sunset, her hands raw, her body aching. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended clothes, trying to earn her keep, trying to make herself indispensable. Hank Kincaid watched her. He rarely spoke to her directly, but his eyes followed her everywhere. It wasn't a kind gaze. It was the look of a man assessing a tool, wondering if it was worth the trouble. The girls were her only comfort. Lula with her fierce loyalty, Sadie with her quiet affection. They were the reason she was here. They were also her chains. The real test, however, wasn't on the ranch. It was in the town, Miller's Crossing. The first trip in was like walking into a cage of wolves. Every eye was on her. The whispers were like the rustle of snakes in dry grass. That's her, the mail-order bride that got left. Kincaid took her in. Can you imagine? Shameless is what it is. Living under his roof. Ida kept her head down, her cheeks burning. She tried to ignore them, but their judgment was a physical force, pressing in on her from all sides. Then she saw Delilah Boone. Delilah was the saloon singer, a woman wrapped in faded crimson silk with a smile as sharp as a razor. She stood on the boardwalk, watching Ida with amusement. Well, now, Delilah's voice carried across the muddy street. Miss Calhoun, is it? Or should we be calling you Mrs. Kincaid already? You certainly landed on your feet. Ida froze. Lula and Sadie stiffened beside her, their small hands balling into fists. I'm here to buy flour, Ida said, her voice barely a whisper. Delilah laughed, a bright, cruel sound. Flour? Is that what you call it? Seems to me you're getting more than flour out at that ranch. Just then, Hank stepped out of the blacksmith shop. He saw the scene, saw the look on Ada's face, saw Delilah's mocking smile. For a moment, Ada's heart plummeted. She thought he would turn away, leave her to be devoured. But he didn't. He walked straight toward them, his steps heavy and deliberate. He stopped in front of Delilah, his shadow falling over her. Mind your tongue, Delilah, he said, his voice a low growl. This woman is under my protection. The boardwalk went silent. Delilah's smile faltered. She looked from Hank's cold, hard face to Ida's, and for the first time a flicker of something other than mockery appeared in her eyes. It looked like fear. She backed away without another word. Hank said nothing more. He just grabbed the flour sack and led them back to the wagon. The ride home was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. Something had changed. He had defended her, publicly. He had claimed her. But why? It wasn't kindness. Hank Kincaid wasn't a kind man. It was something else. Something possessive. He hadn't defended her honor. He had defended his property. That night, she couldn't sleep. The house felt smaller, more suffocating. She found herself staring at a locked door at the end of the hallway. The girls had told her it was their mother's room. Hank had locked it the day she died and never opened it again. A sudden, chilling thought crept into her mind. What was behind that door? What secrets was Hank Kincaid keeping locked away? A few days later, the circuit preacher, Reverend Fletcher, paid them a visit. He stood on the porch, his Bible clutched in his hand like a weapon. His eyes, small and judgmental, flicked from Hank to Ida. "Brother Kincaid," the Reverend began, his voice dripping with false piety. "The town is concerned. It is not proper for this woman, this cast-off, to be living under your roof. It creates an appearance of sin." Hank's face was a mask of stone. He didn't invite the Reverend in. He just stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. "She is a guest in my house, Reverend," Hank said, his voice flat. "A guest?" the Reverend sneered. "Or a replacement? The good book warns us against such impropriety. You shame the memory of your late wife." At the mention of his wife, something dark and dangerous flashed in Hank's eyes. He took a step forward, and the Reverend, for all his bluster, took a hasty step back. "My wife's memory is my business," Hank bit out, "and God's, not yours, and not this town's. Now get off my land." The Reverend scurried away like a frightened rabbit. Hank slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the house. Ida, who had been listening from the kitchen, felt a tremor of fear. This wasn't just a grieving man. This was a man at war with the world, a man who kept his wife's room locked like a tomb. The whispers in town didn't stop. They got worse. Hank's defiance had only fueled the fire. But now, they weren't just whispering about her. They were whispering about him, about his dead wife. "Poor Martha," she heard one woman say at the mercantile. "Trapped out on that prairie with him. It's no wonder she—" The woman stopped when she saw Ida, her face paling. No wonder she what? No wonder she died in a freak blizzard? Or was it something else? Ida started to watch him more closely. She saw the way his hands would clench when he thought no one was looking. The way he would stare out at the endless prairie, his face a storm of emotions she couldn't read. Grief, yes, but also anger, and something that looked terrifyingly like guilt. One evening, as dusk was settling, she saw him standing by the fence line, looking toward the small, lonely grave marker on a nearby hill, his wife's grave. Ada approached him cautiously. "The town talks," she said softly. He didn't turn. "Let them talk." "They talk about your wife," she pressed. Now he turned, and his eyes were blazing. "What do you want from me, woman?" he snarled. "The truth," she whispered. He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "The truth?" he said, stepping closer to her, his sighs overwhelming. "The truth is this is my land, my house, my children, and you are here because I allow it. Remember that." He turned and stalked back to the house, leaving her alone in the fading light. She was a guest. No, she was a prisoner, and she was beginning to suspect that the blizzard hadn't been the only thing that killed Martha Kincaid. A late spring storm hit with the force of a battering ram. The sky turned black in the middle of the afternoon, and the wind screamed like a banshee. Snow, thick and wet, came down in a blinding curtain. The world beyond the windows vanished. They were trapped. The old house groaned and shuddered, timbers straining against the assault. The twins were pale, huddled by the fire, their usual bravado gone. Ida tried to soothe them, telling them a story her grandmother used to tell, but her own heart was pounding with a primal fear. The storm was alive, and it wanted in. Hank moved through the house with a grim purpose, barring shutters, stuffing rags into cracks. Snow was already seeping under the door, melting into dark pools on the floorboards. "It'll be a long night," he said, his voice rough over the roar of the wind. Hours passed. The storm only got stronger. Around midnight, there was a terrible cracking sound from above, followed by a shower of dust and splintered wood from the ceiling. The roof. The weight of the snow was too much. Hank's face was grim in the lantern light. "It's going to collapse," he said. We have to shore it up. What do you need? Ada asked, her voice steady despite the fear clutching at her throat. He looked at her, and for a second she saw a flicker of something she'd never seen before in his eyes. Desperation. I need another pair of hands, he admitted. They climbed into the attic, a cramped, freezing space under the eaves. The wind howled through the gaps in the roof, cutting like a knife. The lantern cast wild, dancing shadows. Beams were already splintered, sagging dangerously. He handed her a hammer. Hold this beam steady. When I tell you, drive the nail in. They worked in a frantic, desperate rhythm. His strength, her speed. The howl of the wind, the crash of the hammer. Snow and ice rained down on them. At one point, a heavy gust of wind blew the lantern out, plunging them into absolute darkness. Ada cried out. The darkness was total, the sound of the world being torn apart all around them. She felt a hand grab her arm, hard. I'm here, Hank's voice shouted over the storm. Don't move. His hand was surprisingly warm, grounding. He fumbled for the matches, and a moment later, the lantern flickered back to life. Their faces were inches apart. She could see the strain in his face, the fear in his eyes. This was not the cold, unreadable man from before. This was a man fighting for his life, for his children's lives. When they finally secured the last brace, they were both exhausted, soaked, and freezing. They climbed down from the attic to find the twins awake, their eyes wide with terror. Is it safe, Pa? Sadie whispered. Hank knelt beside them, his big, rough hand stroking Lula's hair. It's safe, he said, his voice gentler than Ida had ever heard it. They sat by the fire, the storm still raging outside, but the immediate danger had passed. The silence that fell between them was different now. It was filled with the unspoken reality of what they had just faced together. Finally, Hank spoke, his voice low and cracked. You think I'm a cruel man? Ida looked at the fire, not at him. I think you're a man in pain. He let out a long, shuddering breath. I buried my wife in a storm just like this one, he whispered. The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. She went out to check on the livestock. The storm came up fast. I couldn't find her until it was too late. The story was simple, tragic, plausible, but something about it felt wrong. It was too neat, too clean. The whole town watched me, he continued, his voice laced with a bitterness that was terrifying in its intensity. They watched me dig her grave, and they whispered. They've always whispered. Why? Ida asked. Why would they whisper? He finally looked at her, his eyes dark pools of old rage. Because they never thought I was good enough for her. She came from a town family, educated. Her family. They thought she was marrying beneath her. When she died, they looked at me like I'd killed her myself. His pain was real. She could feel it. But it was tangled up with something else. A defensiveness that was almost an admission of guilt. I promised myself I'd never need anyone again, he said, his gaze dropping to the floor. I promised I'd protect my girls. Then they brought you here, and the whispers started all over again. He was pushing her away again, retreating behind his wall of grief and anger. But Ida saw the crack, the tiny fissure he'd revealed in his armor. You're not protecting them by locking the world out, Hank, she said, using his first name for the first time. Silence doesn't keep children warm. He flinched as if she'd struck him. He stood up abruptly and went to the window, staring out at the swirling white chaos. His back was to her, a solid wall of denial. Later that night, as Ida dozed fitfully in her chair by the dying fire, she felt something being draped over her shoulders. It was a quilt. It was intricately stitched with a pattern of faded roses, and it smelled faintly of lavender. She knew without a doubt that it had belonged to his wife, Martha. He had covered her with his dead wife's quilt. It wasn't a gesture of kindness. It was a brand, a claim. He was wrapping her in the ghost of the woman he'd lost, pulling her deeper into the shadows of his house. As dawn broke, the storm finally began to recede. The wind died down to a mournful sigh. And through the silence, another sound emerged, faint, at first, then clearer. The tolling of a church bell from town. It was too early for a Sunday service. The sound was slow, deliberate, a funeral bell. Someone in town had died during the storm, but the sound felt like a warning, a harbinger. The storm outside might be over, but the one inside this house, the one in Miller's Crossing, was just gathering strength. And Ida had a terrible feeling that it was coming for her. The thaw revealed more than just mud and new grass. It revealed secrets. Ida started to piece things together, small things that didn't add up. The way Hank sometimes called Sadie by the name Martha. The way Lula would flinch if he raised his voice, a reaction that seemed too extreme for a girl so bold. And there was still that locked room. One afternoon, while Hank was out mending a fence line on the far side of the property, Ida found herself standing before the locked door again. The key, she knew, was on a ring Hank always kept on his belt. But there had to be another way. She remembered seeing an old set of skeleton keys in a dusty box in the barn. Her hands were trembling as she tried them one by one. The third key turned. The lock clicked. The air that rushed out of the room was stale, cold, and thick with the scent of lavender and dust. The room was perfectly preserved, a shrine to a dead woman. A four-poster bed, neatly made, a wardrobe filled with dresses, a vanity table with silver-backed brushes and perfume bottles. It was on the vanity table, tucked beneath a hairbrush, that she found it. A small, leather-bound diary. Her heart pounded as she opened it. The handwriting was elegant, looping. It was Martha Kincaid's journal. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the entries. They started out happy, full of hope for her new life on the ranch. But as the months and years went on, the tone changed. It became frightened. Hank's moods are a storm I cannot predict, one entry read. He sees the town as his enemy and me as his fortress. But a fortress is also a prison. Another entry was even more chilling. He watches me, always. He says it is because he loves me, but his love feels like a cage. I told him I wanted to visit my sister in Miller's Crossing. He forbade it. He said Delilah was a bad influence. Delilah, his wife's sister. That explained the hostility. Delilah didn't hate Ida because she wanted Hank. She hated Ida because she saw her as a replacement for the sister she'd lost, trapped in the same cage. The final entries were frantic, desperate. I have to leave. I cannot raise my daughters in this house of silence and rage. I have written to a man, a cousin of a friend from back east. He has agreed to help me. He will meet me at the station on the 20th of November. I will tell Hank I am going into town for supplies. It is the only way. The 20th of November. Ada's blood ran cold. That was the day of the blizzard. The day Martha died. And it was the same day 1 year later that Ida herself had been due to arrive at that same station. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. She flipped to the very last page. There was only one sentence, scrawled in a shaky hand. He knows. I saw it in his eyes. God help me. She slammed the book shut, her mind reeling. Hank had lied. Martha wasn't out checking on livestock. She was running away from him, and he knew it. Did he follow her? Did he confront her in the storm? Did he... Ida felt sick. She put the diary back where she found it, locked the door, and stumbled back to the kitchen, her legs barely holding her. She was living in a dead woman's house, with a man who was not a grieving widower, but a jailer. A monster. And then the most terrifying thought of all struck her. The man she was supposed to marry. The man who had abandoned her at the station. Was he the same man Martha had written to? Had he arrived at the station, not to meet a new bride, but to help a desperate woman escape, only to find out he was a year too late? Had he seen Ida, realized the trap he was walking into, and simply fled? She had to get out. She had to take the girls and run. When Hank returned that evening, she could barely look at him. Every word he spoke, every gesture he made, was sinister. She saw the rage simmering just beneath the surface. She saw the possessiveness in his eyes when he looked at his daughters. She started making a plan. She would pack a small bag. She would take what little money she had. At the next trip to town, she would find a way to get herself and the girls on the eastbound train. But she never got the chance. A few days later, a rider came up the path. It wasn't anyone from Miller's Crossing. He was a stranger, dressed in city clothes, his horse slick with sweat. He dismounted and strode toward the house with a look of grim determination. Ida's heart stopped. She recognized him. It was the man from the photograph, the man who was supposed to be her husband. He stormed onto the porch, his eyes scanning the property. He didn't even seem to see Ida standing there, frozen in the doorway. "Kincaid!" he yelled. "I'm here for Martha! Where is she?" Hank came out of the barn, his face like a thundercloud. He saw the stranger, and his hand immediately went to the axe he was carrying. "You've got no business here," Hank growled. "I've got every business," the man shot back. "Martha wrote to me. She was leaving you. I was supposed to meet her a year ago, but my train was delayed by the storms. I've been searching for her ever since. Now, where is she?" Hank just laughed, a cold, dead sound. He pointed with the axe toward the lonely grave on the hill. "There she is," he said. "She went for a walk in a blizzard. Found her the next morning, frozen solid." The man's face went white. He stared at the grave, then back at Hank, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. You killed her." "The storm killed her," Hank said, his voice dangerously low. "She should have stayed where she belonged, in my house." Just then, the twins, drawn by the shouting, ran out of the house. They saw the stranger, then their father with the axe, and they froze. The stranger's eyes fell on Ida. Recognition dawned. You're the woman from the station," he stammered. "I got your letter. I thought, oh God, what is this?" "This," Hank said, taking a menacing step forward, "is my family, and you're trespassing." But before anything else could happen, the sound of hoofbeats filled the air. A wagon was coming up the road, fast. It was Delilah Boone, and she wasn't alone. The Reverend Fletcher was beside her, and behind them, several other men from the town. Delilah jumped down from the wagon before it had even stopped, her face a storm of fury and grief. "I knew it!" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Hank. "I knew you were lying! My sister was trying to escape you, you monster!" It turned out the stranger, whose name was Arthur, had gone to the saloon first, asking questions about Martha. Delilah had overheard him. The story had come tumbling out. She'd rounded up the Reverend and anyone else who would listen, and come straight for the ranch. The whole ugly truth was finally coming out, right here in the muddy yard of the Kincaid ranch. "He kept her a prisoner!" Delilah shrieked at the assembled townsfolk. "He was a jealous, violent man. She wrote to me, told me she was afraid for her life." "That's a lie!" Hank roared, his knuckles white on the handle of the axe. "Is it?" Delilah shot back. "Reverend, you remember when Martha came to you bruised, telling you she'd fallen down the stairs? You told her it was her wifely duty to be more careful, didn't you? You told her to go home and pray for forgiveness." The Reverend's face turned a pasty white. The crowd murmured, their eyes shifting from Hank to the preacher. "And you," Delilah said, turning her venom on Arthur. "You were supposed to save her, but you were late. A year late. You let her die." Arthur could only stare, horrified. Ada stood on the porch, holding the two trembling girls. Her carefully constructed world, her fragile hope for a new life, had been obliterated. She wasn't standing in a home. She was standing on the stage of a tragedy, and the final act was playing out. Hank's rage finally boiled over. He raised the axe. "Get off my land!" he bellowed, his eyes wild. "All of you!" The townsmen backed away, But Delilah stood her ground. "You won't scare us anymore, Hank. Your reign of terror is over." Hank took a step toward her, the axe held high. Sadie screamed, and that's when Ida moved. She pushed the girls behind her and walked down the steps, placing herself directly between Hank and Delilah. "Stop it," she said, her voice clear and strong. It cut through the hate-filled air. "This has to stop." Hank stared at her, his chest heaving, the axe still raised. For a moment, she thought he would strike her down. But his eyes met hers, and something in his face wavered. The rage faltered, replaced by a deep, bottomless despair. He let out a ragged sob and the axe fell from his hand, thudding into the mud. "I didn't kill her," he whispered, the words torn from him. "I swear it. I went after her. I begged her to come back, but she refused. She said she'd rather die in the storm than spend another day in this house. So I let her go. I watched her walk into the snow. I let her go." The confession was more terrible than if he'd admitted to murder. He hadn't killed her with his hands. He'd killed her with his pride. He'd let her walk to her death rather than lose control. Silence fell over the yard. A heavy, damning silence. Delilah wept, her anger finally breaking into grief. Arthur stood, a ghost of a man, his chance at love lost a year ago in a blizzard. The townspeople just stared, their petty gossip turned into a horrifying reality. Hank Kincaid sank to his knees in the mud, a broken man. His daughters, his two brave, desperate daughters, who had tried to mend their broken family by stealing a bride, ran to him, wrapping their small arms around his shaking shoulders. Eda watched them, her heart aching. The justice that had been uncovered was a brutal, messy thing. It had shattered everyone it touched. She looked at Arthur, the man who should have been her husband. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with apology and regret. He turned without a word, mounted his horse, and rode away, a man forever haunted by a ghost. Delilah, her tears spent, walked over to Ida. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved him from doing something he could never take back. My sister, she would have liked you." Delilah then went to the wagon and helped the Reverend, now a shrunken, disgraced figure, climb aboard. The other townsfolk slowly dispersed, leaving the family alone in the wreckage. Eda was left with a choice. She could leave. She could walk away from this broken man and his haunted children, and no one would blame her. But as she looked at Hank, kneeling in the mud, clutching his daughters, she didn't see a monster. She saw a man who had been so consumed by fear of loss that he had created the very thing he dreaded. She saw a man who had finally, brutally, been stripped of all his secrets. She walked over to him. She knelt in the mud beside him. She placed her hand on his shoulder. He looked up at her, his face streaked with dirt and tears. "You should go," he rasped. "I'm poison." "No," she said softly. "You're just a man. We all are. And this house doesn't need any more ghosts." She helped him to his feet. Together the four of them walked back into the house. It was still a house of sorrow, but for the first time, it was also a house of truth. The healing would be long. The scars would never truly fade. But as Ida lit the lamp, chasing the shadows from the corners of the room, she knew she wasn't a prisoner anymore. She was home. If you were moved by Ida's journey from a cast-off bride to the heart of a broken family, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that explore the darkness and the light of the human heart.